All right, and as promised, we're going to focus on climate change with the upcoming climate summit. This is a very important question because while Africa might not be a leading contributor to climate change, we do bear the brunt, particularly in the ASAL region. And with climate change effects, we have more ripple effect. For example, the rights of women get interfered with. We have conflict between wildlife and local communities. We also have situations whereby children are not even able to go back to school as usual. And we're trying to find out how Africa can actually play a part in ensuring that our communities, our environments are secured and protected from the harsh effects of climate change. And joining me to have this particular discussion from IFAO is Maurice Nyaligu, who is conservation leader and specialist in planning, management and monitoring of wildlife species and conservation spaces. He has worked close for close to 2 decades in leadership positions at Africa Wildlife Foundation, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the International Fund for Animal Welfare. And that's under the banner that you're bringing yourself here today, right? Now, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I'd like to start off because we've talked about climate change, we have the effect, we have all that, but speak to us about what IFAO does before we get into and understand how we can change things for the better.
So the International Fund for Animal Welfare is a global non-profit organization that seeks to help animals and people thrive together.
Okay.
We started initially in 1969 as a campaign towards halting the hunting of the white coat seal. But increasingly, we have moved into 40 countries and are working on the animal rescue, animal welfare, animal release, and restoring and connecting landscapes.
Okay, and describe the impact of climate change on wildlife in Africa and even in Kenya in particular, because we do know wildlife is one of our top income earners when it comes to foreign exchange. So when wildlife is impacted, the whole country is impacted. So what is the impact on the continent and in Kenya?
So when you look at the impact of climate change on the African continent, that has been bad over the couple of years.
Yes.
When you look at the past 10 years, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, there's been a lot of impact on both wildlife and people.
Yes.
Our experience as the International Fund for Animal Welfare shows that in areas where we are working, both people and wildlife have been impacted negatively. In the Kaza, that is the southern landscape of Kavango and Zambezi, for example, the 2019 drought, we lost 200 elephants in Zimbabwe.
Wow.
Yeah, and of course, recently in 2021, 2022, as you know, in the Amboseli ecosystem, there was significant loss of wildlife, and not just in Amboseli, but Kenya's as an overall key wildlife area.
Right.
Some of the species that we are looking at are range restricted, others are endemic. For example, gravy zebras, which were impacted with a lot of grazing pressure and loss of grazing pasture. These are range restricted and very iconic to the Kenyan and Ethiopian cluster area.
Yeah, so that's pretty vast. But I'm wondering, you talked about wildlife as well as human impact by climate change. How build for us a bridge, so to speak, with your words, between wildlife and humans that are sharing the same ecosystem under these effects of climate change.
Okay, so as a case example, in the 2021-2022 drought, with the loss of prey species in some of our protected areas, there was a lot of pressure for the carnivores to move into community areas where livestock is abundant.
Yes.
And remember, both local people and wildlife were significantly affected by loss of numbers. And so as animals move into human areas, seeking prey that is not available in protected areas as a result of the climate change induced severity of droughts, then you have conflict eventually. I've seen even in the local media in recent past, you've seen that there have been cases of human-wildlife conflict in specific hotspot areas around the country.
Yes.
And some of which are a result of these climate-induced impacts.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And so what must we do?
We must work collectively. There's now opportunities for us to work through an integrated approach to be able to use the Africa Climate Summit in particular, which brings about a couple of African heads of state to re-energize and try to leverage on available funding from development partners.
Yes.
As you mentioned in your introductory remarks, Africa is bearing the cost.
Yeah.
But as we know that a lot of this is happening in the industrial countries.
This is happening
So
as
they
well.
need to be made to recommit their commitments under the Paris Agreement to ensure sustained and increased funding, particularly to entities around this area.
Right. And speaking of that, this has been a subject of conversation for a while now, COP26, COP27, and the upcoming one. I mean, explain to our viewers how increased funding towards climate change would actually help organizations such as IFAO, such as government and governments and other organizations just be able to tackle this, because we do know that Africa has a lot of developing countries, so we cannot afford it. Speak to us about that importance.
Okay, if I give you an example, Africa's protected areas, they're not just subsidizing, they're not just important assets for the African continent. They are subsidizing the rest of humanity in conservation terms.
Okay.
So when you look like Kenya, for example, 8% of our land is under protected areas, national parks. When you increase the available space under community conservancies, it goes almost to 20%.
Yeah.
And countries like Tanzania, they have set about 30 to 35% of their land mass as a protected area. These protected areas provide opportunities because they are important carbon sinks. Elephants, for example, sequester carbon through the natural processes, returning it back into the landscapes and releasing it slowly. When the number of elephants is reduced, the ability of some of these protected areas to sequester carbon and retain carbon from going into the atmosphere is severely impacted.
Okay.
So the Africa Climate Summit provides opportunities to leverage funding outside of the traditional role that we've seen our conservation areas play, so that we have nature-based solutions that work for both people and wildlife. Yes.
And far from the nations in the West and the East that have contributed to climate change, also we are having organizations on the ground that are already working on mitigating the impacts of climate change. Is IFAO implementing any interventions towards making national parks and surrounding communities more climate resilient?
We are working with our partners. Maybe I need to remind you that our key role here is government.
Yes.
So we work with government agencies, the Kenya government and other governments in particular. We are implementing an initiative, a transnational initiative in Africa called the Room to Rome Initiative.
Okay.
The Room to Rome Initiative is looking at specific cluster sites that we call cluster sites that are providing opportunities for climate resilience. And by climate resilience, I mean landscapes that are able to withstand the impacts and severity of climate-induced impacts, such as drought. Once you work with the national government, agencies and entities, in Amboseli, for example, we are working with Kenya Wildlife Service, the county government of Kajiado, other development partners and peer organizations to ensure that there is available space in terms of corridor connectivity to enable species move into areas that potentially lend themselves for additional conservation areas.
It's funny that you just mentioned Amboseli, and it has been on the news today for its charge has been taken from organizations back to the county government. What do you think is the role or needs to be the role of local communities that are surrounding these particular areas in terms of keeping them up and ensuring that they are more sustainable? I've
seen that there's been a lot of positive reception from local communities with that decision by His Excellency the President. It provides both opportunities and challenges for co-management of protected areas. In terms of opportunities, there are opportunities for both vertical and horizontal integration to bring other partners who may not necessarily have been in the line of government to provide additional financing and leveraging into these protected areas. What do I mean? For example, there are people who are working to develop innovative tools on compensation within the private sector. By being part of this process, they are able to provide solutions that speak to human-wildlife conflict.
Yes.
There are others who are able to provide solutions on smart conservation and agriculture.
Right.
Others are able to provide solutions for sustainable funding. So I think we echo their decision by the government, but also we are cognizant of the fact that there are challenges that will emerge out of this in terms of governance and the overall expectations.
Challenges that must be anticipated,
yes,
right?
Yes.
What else do you think needs to be done?
What needs to be done also is to look at the overall framework in terms of planning, the management and planning of these conservation areas. We know that there's a lot of incentive to have the counties develop spatial plans that speak to these specific interventions. Without an overall framework for spatial planning, it becomes a bit difficult because solutions that speak to protected areas per se must be seen in the context of the wider environment.
There's a lot of science that goes into all of this from what you're saying, right?
Yes.
Speak to us about the need for expertise, the available expertise, and perhaps some of the science-based solutions that IFAO is bringing up to the ground.
So as I mentioned, we are working under Room to Roam, which is a science-based approach. We are using the African elephant savanna, the savanna subspecies of the African elephant, as a case example to showcase what happens to these landscapes using data that has been accrued from decades of research of the African elephant, particularly with the cluster populations around the Kavango Zambezi area, of which we've been part of that for a very long time. But it's informing us on how to make innovative solutions in other clusters where we are working, in areas like Amboseli, the Tsavo, parts of Tanzania, in the Malawi, Zambia cluster areas.
All right. And also, of course, there's the matter of climate resistant, resilient landscapes. Explain that to me. Even I don't understand what that means, but it seems like a good thing for the environment. From just the word, I think it would point to an environment that can weather the storms being posed by climate change.
Yes.
Explain that to our viewers.
So in a layman's term,
once
you invest in landscapes that have the potential to withstand the rigors of climate change, in terms of connectivity, in terms of investments in mitigation and adaptation, in terms of resilience of communities. I gave you a case example of the work that we are doing with the women groups. We're implementing a project called Building Resilience Amongst Disadvantaged Gender Groups in Wildlife-Rich Areas. And that shows that when you target, specific gender entities that are afflicted by the impacts of living with wildlife around their areas, you are able to create win-win scenarios.
Absolutely.
So the issue in Amboseli, for example, the data that we have seen from human-wildlife conflict cases is disproportionately leaning towards women.
Oh, wow.
For obvious reasons, the women are the ones who go and collect water. They are much more likely to encounter wildlife around point water sources.
That's true.
And that is what happens when you meet elephants and all this. And it has also an impact with the capacity of women to raise viable families. So there's a social dimension to all this as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So when you're tackling the effects, you're also helping the family unit.
Exactly.
And which is very, very important. Well, critics say international summits are big on hypes, but weak on implementation. I've talked about COP26, 27. And what are the aspirations in the as we look forward to the upcoming climate summit, Africa Climate Summit?
First of all, I'll disagree with what the critics say.
Yeah?
It's not a very accurate picture because these summits provide opportunities for Africa to speak with one voice.
True.
Very rarely do you see the continent speak with one voice on issues that are afflicting them across the entire continent. And I think the Africa Climate Summit provides such an opportunity. Secondly, it's also an opportunity for exchange of knowledge to act as a catalyst for collective thinking around specific solutions. Remember that Africa and the various countries, in reality, those are just demarcations on a map.
Right.
Because when you look at the parcel lists in Ethiopia, they're probably just crossing into Kenya. The impacts that will happen across the borders will affect each African continent in about the same measure.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about, as we talk about solution, of course, we have to look at it from the mid-term to long-term, right? We can't decide something at a summit today and expect it to be working, next week or the next month. So speak to us about the mid-term and long-term aspirations in terms of solutions.
So in terms of mid-term, our expectation is that the development partners and the African governments recommit to the agreements they agreed in Paris. And in the long term, we are hoping to see that many of these protected areas, our landscape, become resilient in the long term.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And as we conclude the conversation, I do believe IFAO is working, has a place in the upcoming African Climate Summit, right? Speak to us about how involved you are in that upcoming summit, which is very important, and it's going to be quite the big news in the next coming weeks.
No, we are providing support as required.
Yeah.
We are working with the governments in the areas where we are engaged. And we are also engaging with other peer organizations and players within the civil society organization.
Okay. Perhaps I've left something out. Would you like to add something about conservation, climate change, and the summit that we are expecting?
Well, is to look forward to this summit. I'm sure that we are all eagerly looking forward to it because it has implications on our future generations.
Right.
And it has implications on our well-being as well. And also to commend KTN for being pivotal in this.
Yeah, showcasing this, having such conversations. Thank you as well, and thank you for the work that you're doing on the continent as far as mitigating the effects of climate change is concerned. All right. Now, we were earlier on trying to get in touch with international affairs expert Abel Oyeyo, and I do understand we have him.